Uh-oh. All right, here we are. Okay, it looks like we're live. Welcome to Acid Horizon, the theory podcast. Today, Adam and myself, Craig, are delving into the profound themes of grief and Stoicism through the works of Seneca, Cicero, and Epictetus. And returning to the podcast is the esteemed Dr. Gregory B. Sadler, a luminary in both academic and para-academic circles and a vital resource for online philosophy education. Dr. Sadler's extensive contributions include his YouTube channel, which has recently peaked at over 150,000 subscribers, if I'm not mistaken, and is a font of philosophical insights, which have been invaluable to students and enthusiasts alike. Additionally, he has been recognized for his ongoing work with Reason.io and his insightful commentary on classical philosophy. Thank you, Greg, for joining us again live on this Friday afternoon in June.
You're very welcome. That's quite a talk up. So I hope you haven't built me up too much,
I think we always do that. Yeah. But I have to say, when we announced our summer plans, I was extremely happy when you particularly DM'd about collaborating again. And for so many reasons, you'll always have a seat at the table here, but also your message caught me at a moment where I was actually kind of feeling down. And it was just nice to know that, hey, there's someone in our corner, and it's Dr. Greg Sadler. And we often, I think it's necessary for us to have these occasional interventions with ancient Greek philosophy and ancient Roman philosophy. And we think there's none better than you to have on our show. I think it's a good fit for us. And I think the topic of grief seems somehow appropriate to tackle this year for a number of reasons. And so I was hoping that you could just get started today by letting us know. I think you're developing a course or some materials on grief and Stoicism, and maybe you can talk about some other things that you're putting together right now.
Sure. Yeah, I haven't actually thought about putting together a course, although that's actually a good idea, given that, the issue's never going to go away. It's more I've been writing pieces in my Substack because I got invited to go to Wyoming Stoic Camp, which was in early May, and they want you to have a topic to talk about. So I thought, well, I've been doing stuff on grief, in part motivated by losses that I had and what I found useful. So I'll just do a talk about that, and then you start digging into the text that you've read before but maybe didn't look as closely at, and you see some really useful stuff. So I'm writing a series. I've only written the first entry in it, but I imagine it'll probably be about like 10 posts or so exploring different aspects, and I got to try it out with the participants at the Wyoming Stoic Camp, and they seem to understand it pretty well and find it useful and challenging. So yeah, I think there's a lot to call out of it, in part because you get this I know neither of you two are subject to this, but there may be some listeners or viewers who are. You get this idea that comes from the popular conceptions of Stoicism that aren't real Stoic philosophy, that to be a Stoic means like you just turn everything off, you got expressionless face, don't feel that pain, stuff it down, whatever you want to call it, right? And I mean, that's almost guaranteed to screw you up as a human being, whether it's grief or anger or fear, pick whatever emotion it is. If you're not actually dealing with it, then you're going to have problems. But, you don't want to swing to the other side where people will be like, oh, well, any emotion you feel is A-okay. No, some of our emotions are screwed up and we want to look at them. And so I'm not going to say Stoicism exclusively does this, but you want to have some theory that allows you to get at the mechanics of what it is you're feeling and why you're feeling it and whether it makes sense. And then you can actually get a handle on it. So, the Stoics, they dealt with the same kind of life crap that we do, deaths of people that we care about. And I don't think that the ones that were writing were quite as invested in their jobs as we contemporary Americans are. And a lot of other people all over the world as well, but Americans are particularly prone to that. But, you lose a job, you feel a sense of grief with that. Relationships that break down, they were facing that. just as much, although perhaps they didn't have a casual hookup culture like we do, or anything, right? So yeah, there's a huge scope for it, I think.
Well, before we dig into that, I want to ask you about Wyoming Stoic Camp and just Stoic
Ooh.
Camp in general, because I'm imagining a Far Side comic where they don't show up with the Chinese food for lunch and everybody's just losing their mind and the whole thing collapses. But like, honestly, like, what are some of the rewarding aspects of doing something like that? Maybe not just a Stoic camp, but like a philosophy gathering of that
Yeah,
sort.
I think it could be done for other things as well. Sort of, it's not quite a boot camp. There's nobody yelling at you, calling you maggots, making you do push-ups or anything like that. That's for the weirdo bros that wanna, you've seen those
Of course.
images, right?
Yeah, we've talked all about this before. Yeah.
Yeah. So there's a couple different Stoic camps. There's one in Wyoming that's been going on for 10 years. And that's Rob Coulter and the University of Wyoming that run and support it. Massimo Pigliucci does one in Rome. There's one actually happening in Spain that, interestingly enough, is a walking camp where they are going along the Compostelo pathway, which is usually for Christian pilgrims. And they're doing the walk and talk sort of thing. And there's one in New York as well. And I may be leaving some out. So it's a phenomenon that's been around for a while. And, you could think of it as sort of like a retreat. People do all these Christian or yoga retreats or things like that. You go off somewhere and, you can still keep your phone. They don't take them away from you, but you're usually going out somewhere you don't have good reception. And you're bunking with other people. So there's cabins and, it's pretty Spartan not in the actual, like, we're going to go and kill helots or anything like that. But things are reduced to kind of a bare minimum. This one they held at a church camp. And so the church camp people are making all the food and, I guess they do everything else that has to be done. And, you wake up in the morning, go have breakfast, hang out with the other people, chat about stuff. And then there would be activities like going on basically much of the day, although there's time for going off on walks by yourself. It's out in the countryside, which at that time of year is pretty stark and kind of cool looking. There's hikes to go up, on the ridges and watch the sunrise and stuff like that. But a lot of it is study. And so at this one, they provided all of the participants with a copy of Seneca's letters and a copy of Marcus Aurelius's Meditations. And one of the big activities that they did each day was to, and I kind of like this actually, it's something I'd like to start incorporating. So everyone would just sit in a big circle and somebody would start reading from the text. And they'd read as much as they wanted, usually a paragraph. And then you'd stop and people would ask questions or make comments about what you just read. And so there was a good bit of having to clarify things. Some of the translations are not great. They can be a little bit tricky. So those of us who could go back to the Greek or Latin would say, this is what's going on. So they did that in the group for Seneca. And then in the afternoon, they'd split everybody up into smaller groups. And they'd do the same thing. And then Rob and I would circulate around basically to be sounding boards and help people out when they got mixed up. And I'm going to say something that's a little pejorative right here.
Sure.
So, there's a lot of translations of these Stoic texts out there. And particularly of Marcus Aurelius's Meditations. Actually, I'll say two pejorative things. So the one is, if you ever run into somebody who says they're into Stoicism and the only thing they've read is the Meditations, they're usually full of crap. And because, the real Stoic literature isn't just reading your way through the Meditations. It's Seneca, Epictetus, these kind of heavy hitters. So anyway, there's a lot of people who are just into the Meditations because it's, kind of a mess. You can pick and choose whatever you want from it. It's not systematically organized or anything. So there are a bunch of different translations, and we had one by Robin Waterfield, and boy, did it create a lot of hassles for people because he chose weird ways to translate things. I think he needed
Mm.
to put like his own particular stamp on it. So, we'd go in these small groups and they say, "What is this about?" And I'd say, "I don't know." Because I don't read Waterfield.
Mm.
And so we'd go and look at the Greek and we'd be like, "That's not what it's saying at all. I don't know why the hell he translated things
Mm.
this way." And then they'd say, "Okay, well, now what you're saying actually makes more sense." And so you got to kind of watch out for those sorts of things. And how would you know if you don't actually know the original, right?
Mm. Well, it
Um,
sounds like too that, ever since I was at least 16 or 17 years old, you'd walk into your equivalent of a Barnes and Noble's, Marcus
yeah,
Aurelius Meditations would just be sitting there. But then with the sort of like Stoic Renaissance from 10 years back up
yeah.
until now, at least what you get is a convergence of enthusiasts and academics who can sort of hash these issues out and improve the quality of the readings across the
Yeah,
board.
that's hopefully what you get. And in a place like a Stoic camp, you're gonna get that, right? The trouble is that like you mentioned, there's a renaissance going on. And I wonder if like the other renaissances in time also included this element. There's money to be made, right?
Mm.
There's a greater interest. And so you get people who really don't know anything about Stoicism other than what they glean from like Wikipedia and a few other sites. And they put together, images. Nowadays, they're all like AI generated and they're
Right.
all these weird things that make Seneca or Marcus Aurelius look like they're super badasses when, they would have rejected that sort of thing, but it sort of reflects their idea of what stoicism is. It's going to
Mhm.
make you tough and a warrior,
Yeah.
and they have their quotes, most of which are poorly sourced, none of which are actually they don't go and look at the books to see whether they're there. So there's a lot of fake quotes floating around now, and
Mm.
then they'll put together like lists of the top 10 stoic practices for super fueling your existence, or I'm just kind of making phrases up right here.
No, that's
It
probably
shows you
true,
how
like
easy it is to do, right?
right.
You can just like make this crap up. And so unfortunately, ideally what would happen is the best stuff would, as we say, the cream floats to the top. But
Mm.
given algorithms, it's the schlock floats to the top.
Yeah.
So we're constantly fighting against this whole stream of hucksters who
Mm.
want to make a buck, getting people to like, there's always like a funnel, as they
Yeah.
say. And the end of the funnel is like their book or their coaching sessions or whatever it happens to be, and so it's a struggle, and I mean that's a great training ground for would-be stoics, because you got to deal with the disappointment of seeing your higher quality posts not getting read by many people, but totally schlocky stuff getting read by hundreds of thousands, or videos with a bunch of fake quotes getting 1 million views, whereas like
Right.
well-researched stuff doesn't quite so
Mm.
much. But I suspect it's probably always like that, when we go back into like 19th century literature, there was a lot of crappy stuff, right? I mean, we don't know about it because it all kind of fell through the cracks over time as people quit buying those books and people quit talking about them. But I think at any point in time, you've always got a bunch of people who are just, trying to make a buck off of.
Yeah. Well, I found out something recently that was somewhat shocking, and I thought I had all of the Friedrich Nietzsche myths debunked, but the one
Oh,
thing that I didn't know was not true was the whole incident. Well, is unconfirmed or poorly confirmed anyway. Is the incident at Turin where he hugs the horse?
okay.
Evidently, that is not substantiated. I mean, Keegan from Essential Salts, who's going to be on our show in like 2 weeks, he mentioned that that was a piece of journalism that came out 10 years after he had died
Oh,
and then
interesting.
propagated itself as a kind of myth. And of course, there's the myths about, Nietzsche having syphilis and Nietzsche
Right.
being an
Yeah.
incel and not being very smart with the ladies and so forth. And all of that is easily debunked just by picking up like the biography, I Am Dynamite. Like if you just take the time to read that, you would,
You know,
get some of that.
it's interesting because as you're talking about that, I'm thinking, I didn't know,
Yeah,
but then
exactly.
again, in my like approach to Nietzsche, it's one of those things where like, well, I don't care. I mean, nothing for me rides on whether he hugged a horse or not, because I'm interested in what he's actually like
Sure.
saying, right? And I think that there's quite a few things in any philosophy that are like that. And I'll bring one up that I'm sure is going to like steer the conversation off track, but we'll come back to the main topic later,
Yeah, no,
hopefully.
this is fine. This is fine.
So, and this is a puzzle on my part. And I get this really in all sorts of venues. There's a lot of people who, when I talk about the Stoics in any way, they're super interested in the Stoics because supposedly they inspired the American founding fathers.
Mm.
And, I think that, okay, yeah, a lot of these founding father types were actually reading philosophy. They weren't like committed to Stoicism. I mean, even Jefferson, I don't think is really that committed to Epicureanism as a philosophy, because there's not much of it out there, to actually draw on. I mean, there's contemporary Epicureans, libertines in France at the time, but there's not like a ton of people who have like a whole corpus or anything. And the idea that we should care about the Stoics because they inspired the founding fathers, I'm always like, well, why should we give a shit about that? I mean, they're not special. They weren't saints. They're, I mean, do we have an attitude towards them like people had in Rome towards Romulus or Numa Pompilia? I mean, all that was BS anyway, right?
Right.
And so you get all these people, and I sound like I'm putting them all down. A lot of them are very successful and intelligent people, but they got this weird blind spot that somehow the quality of a philosophy depends on which political figures, legendary political figures, who hardly anyone actually reads. They read biographies about them or book secondary lit stuff. They're not actually like reading the papers of the presidents or the Federalist Papers and anti-Federalist papers or stuff like that. I don't know why we should care one bit, but it seems to be a very, very popular stand. And I mean, there's talk about, can we use this to like drive engagement? Should we do articles about the founding fathers and Stoicism? And my attitude is, man, let somebody else do that. I couldn't care less,
I mean, I don't know if you remember, like 10 years ago, there was an article in the Smithsonian magazine. It was on Thomas Jefferson. And
okay,
the thrust of the article was he was an absolute coward when it came to punishing his slaves. He was not an Epicurean. I mean, basically, he was running a business, I mean, on his plantation, essentially, paying the slave boys and like handfuls of meat. And then when it came time to discipline them, I forget the person whom he hired, but basically he had to hire somebody to whip his slaves in the end. And so he holds none of these sort of like mythical characteristics that are projected upon him.
And he's a weird one. Oh, what's that?
I'd say much like a Roman Emperor. I mean, as a non-American citizen, the first time I went to DC, you do wonder, like, why are all these pillars here? Why is there a faces carved into everything? And you're just like, oh, these guys really thought they were Roman. And thinking about, where do we get these sources for the lives of philosophers and the lives of great political figures? It's interesting how much more of a problem it is. I mean, this is just my bit, maybe I'm wrong, for particularly the Greek philosophers as opposed to the Romans. Because for most Greek philosophers, we're running off of one guy. We're running off of Diogenes Laertius for like most of the stories we get off of like all the famous stories of Diogenes and Alexander, and we get fragments of people who may as well be gossiping about each other, and it's this interesting projection or narrative, or you can even say identification we have with the lives of philosophers. If we want to be philosophers, do we have to live like them? Which is, I guess, quite a Stoic question.
Yeah, and there's the living like them in the sense of like following the reasoning processes, trying to do similar disciplinary regimes, and thinking about what they might do in difficult situations. And then there's all the weird, wacky, like it's totally arbitrary stuff. I mean, the Diogenes is a great example, because you want to be a cynic. Okay, well, you got a lot of choices about who you could actually follow. There's Diogenes, and yeah, we get the Diogenes Laertes stuff, and Dio Chrysostom has got some probably fictional stuff about him, and there's other. Epictetus liked him as well, but if I was going to be a cynic, which I don't want to be anyway, I would pick Antisthenes or Crates or one of the other ones who actually seem to be a decent human being and not kind of an asshole. Because what was the cynic? It wasn't just about like holding the mirror up to society, man, and showing everybody they're hypocrites. It was supposed to be like turning people towards moral goodness and helping them realize that a lot of the things they worry about aren't worth worrying about, that there's higher things that you should be concerned with. And I think Crates was probably better at doing that than, well, I mean, he had more students, certainly, including Zeno. Diogenes had a lot of admirers, but, Crates stuck with him, but Crates was kind of a mild-tempered guy. So, yeah.
So, well, like, yeah, do you see that? Yeah, somebody in the stream wrote one of the cynics that didn't masturbate in public.
One of the many cynics who didn't, Although we should point out that Crates and Hipparchia actually did probably have sex in public. They were a married couple, I mean, we don't know for certain, but they certainly had kids, because that's part of the like lore and legends about them. How do you spell these cynics' names? So Antisthenes is Antisthenes, and then Crates is simpler, Crates.
Yeah, I think that's right.
Yeah.
Well, before we turn the discussion to grief and not public masturbation, let's just shout out the channel. This is Acid Horizon with Dr. Greg Sadler. And if you're listening for the first time or the second or third time, or maybe this is the last time, please subscribe to our Patreon channel. We have reading groups ongoing. We have merch, like I got the Acid Horizon t-shirt here. And just want to say thanks to you again, Greg, for coming on the show.
Oh, sure.
Want to talk about grief. Now, I was wondering what the good entry point was for this. And I want to keep, as many sort of listeners involved and keep the buy-in pretty strong at the beginning. You and I share a background in that we've taught Stoicism in a prison environment. And we know Epictetus, like I taught Epictetus and Seneca in incarceration. But let's just start at the point of grief itself and Stoicism. I know that you're not a purist when it comes to Stoic beliefs, but what is it about Stoicism in particular that you find to be particularly valuable on the subject of grief, and how does it dovetail with maybe the nuances of your personal views?
Okay, yeah, that's quite a lot. I would say that, so this, in general, the Stoics' approach to the emotions is one of the strongest ones in ancient philosophy for highlighting what we call the cognitive aspect of emotion, meaning that emotions aren't just these feelings or, animal responses. There's thoughts and judgments and assumptions built into them. And if we realize that, we can analyze them, or we can have somebody else like help us from the outside and say, hey, you're thinking this, and that's why you're feeling this. And so when it comes to grief specifically, the Stoics help to unpack a lot of those assumptions and judgments and viewpoints that we have. And we realize that some of them are actually poorly founded. Like maybe they have root in the way our society is, or Cicero even brings up like parents who, if their children, go to like a funeral and they don't appear to be sad, they'll punish them so that they can get the children to, I'll give you something to cry about, sort of thing. And what is that based in? All sorts of mistaken understandings of, what's worth grieving about or expressing lamentation about, and what's not, So I'm not going to say that like they're the only people, even in ancient times, who have anything valuable to say, but we do have a lot from them, specifically in Seneca and in Cicero's Tusculan disputations, where he's not a Stoic himself, but he really sees a lot of value in their stuff. And to a lesser extent, I would say in Epictetus, although he has some useful ideas as well. And one of the things that I'm particularly attracted to, so this is kind of jumping way ahead into what's great about the Stoics on grief, and this one's just in Seneca. He's got these two letters, 63 and 99, where he's writing to this friend Lucilius, and in the first case, Lucilius's friend has died, and so he's consoling him. And in the second case, he sends him another letter that he wrote to a different guy whose child had died. And the very first part of the letter is, "Hey, Lucilius, I'm sending you this letter, hopefully to be useful to you." So presumably Lucilius is still grieving, and then he sends him this other guy's letter. And in there's a couple things that I really like about Seneca's treatment. So the first thing is that Seneca, as opposed to some of the other figures, I mean, Epictetus says it's okay to like lament with somebody who's lost their kid, but don't groan inwardly, don't grieve inwardly. Seneca says it's natural for you to grieve, even to cry, and that's okay. What I want for you to do is not to do it excessively or motivated by the wrong reasons, right? And I'd like you ideally to stop your grieving before it just like wears itself out, so that it can be something voluntary. But I'm not going to say you have to do it like tomorrow or anything. And Seneca says even the sage will shed tears. I think that's really massive, because the sage is this ideal superhuman type who maybe we don't, maybe they never exist, or, we don't really know of the sage, but they're like a model for us to follow. Even that person would shed some tears. And if they don't, that's not virtue. That's actually inhumanity, he calls it. And so I like that aspect. I think that's really quite important to offset the, "Ooh, I'm a tough guy" kind of thing. And then the other thing that I really like about Seneca's treatment is that he says, nothing prevents you from continuing your relationship. If your relationship is over as the body goes into the ground, it wasn't much of a relationship. And that's something wrong with you, not with the other person, because you can remember, you've got this faculty of memory as a human being. You can keep that image of the person that you loved alive in your memory as long as you want to. That's a resource. Now, of course, if you got a crappy memory because you're lazy and all you do is watch TV all day, maybe you don't have that as a capacity, right? But this is, where it's something up to us. And Seneca talks about a friend of his, Attalus, who talks about the memories of lost friends are kind of a bittersweet pleasure. He uses all these culinary terms. It's sweet, but it's also bitter or sour, or they had another taste that they distinguished, the harsh or austere, like what you get with tannin with acorns or red wine or things like that. And Seneca says, I'll go even a little bit further. My memories of my lost friends are just sweetness. And realizing that that's possible for us, that we don't have to, let's say you lose a parent, right? And of course, your parents aren't perfect people, but you do want to go back and think about them and remember them. And you don't have to do so in a hero worshiping way or anything like that. You can bring up, within your memory, this person who's now gone, and it can be fulfilling or enjoyable for you. And you don't have to like make yourself cry to do that, because would they want that? That's not helpful for them. They're just as dead. You're not going to bring them back to life by feeling sadness when you've actually like managed to move on. And I'll mention, I know I'm talking a lot. I'll mention one other thing. So, I've been posting about grief lately, and actually I posted something about my mom, who died 24 years ago, and how she got pressured into going on a river rafting trip by her boyfriend, who was kind of a skeevy guy, like tore pages out of her journal. Who knows what he was trying to hide. And she died. She drowned, and so did one other person on the raft, because they had no business being out there. It actually led to legislation being passed in Costa Rica to like rein in these fly-by-night river rafting companies, right? And it's 24 years, right? And I post stuff like that, or I'll post about my mom on Mother's Day, or my dad who died when I was only 11 on Father's Day, and people will invariably they'll say things like, "Oh, I'm so sorry for your loss," you know. Sometimes they'll say, "Oh, I lost my mom a little while back," or something like that. And I'll say, well, it's nice that you're expressing that, but I'm not sad about it. I mean, if I was still sad about it 24 years later, what the hell would be wrong with me? You know, why would I just be like clinging to that sadness when I have the option to do otherwise? And how would I be qualified in any way to talk to anybody about managing their emotions if I can't deal with the lack of somebody 24, or what would it be in the case of my dad? It was 82 that he died. So 42 years later, I should be like losing myself in grief. Now, you know, it doesn't mean that I don't occasionally feel something. I go out to this state park that I used to go to as a kid with my parents, and I walk by myself in the familiar landscape with all the smells and sights, and I think about them, and I do feel a sense of, it sucks that they got so little time. You know, my mom, she was exactly my age now when she died, and my dad was only 36. And I can sort of think about what it was like for little Greg it was probably worse for my sister, who was even younger, you know. But I can think of what it was like for that little guy back then to feel the loss and not be able to relate to I was lucky I had two good parents, you know. If I had crappy parents, maybe I wouldn't grieve at all, you know. But that's sort of like what Seneca calls a bite or a sting. It's not a full emotion. It's just this little twinge. And it's totally okay to have that sort of thing. Doesn't mean that like you're going down the path into depression or melancholy or whatever you want to call it, right? So I think those are some really great aspects of at least Seneca's treatment of this. And Seneca is arguably an Orthodox Stoic, so I think he has these ideas to offer us that we can then incorporate into our own life. And, you know, we could maybe do this not just for the loss of a person, but the loss of a relationship or the loss of a job, other things we grieve over.
Absolutely. Adam, do you want to get in there before I say something?
Absolutely, because this reading the Seneca discussion has opened up a lot of previous things for me. I did
Yeah.
one of my earliest undergrad papers in the course was called Moral Psychology, and it was on the philosophical sort of problem of grief. And the question which has sort of been sort of revived in my mind by hearing Greg is thinking about, well, what is the object of grief? Because he said for the Stoics specifically, there's a cognitive content to emotions, and if it's referential, what's it referencing? Does the emotion stem from the absence of the object? Is death a kind of a causal object here? Is it the loss of the relation? And this is exactly the problem that Stoicism is trying to combat, because the traditional, I guess, maybe analytic, let's say, philosophical problem of grief is that if the person's death is a reason to grieve, and their death is is it basically forever? Then why do we stop grieving if rationally the reason never goes away? Which is a completely abstract way of thinking about it, but it is nonetheless a philosophical problem. And I also just got to pick up as well on the sage being someone who weeps, because I mean I can't help but think of John 11. Was it John 11:15? Literally the shortest line in the Bible. John 11:35. Sorry, Jesus wept. And I'm like, why is he weeping? He doesn't even believe in death. Like,
Yeah.
I mean, oh, go ahead.
Oh, yeah. One of the things that kind of came to mind was an image. I mean, thinking stoically about grief, and it was particularly this letter by Seneca. I think it was 99 that stood out to me. This particular passage where he says, well, I'll just read what Seneca has written, because the sentence itself is beautiful. I mean, talking about, well, first, let me put forward the image, which is there's a way in which the emotions that trigger grief, and any emotion for that matter, can be like a house guest. there is a threshold or a sort of length of time in which a particular emotion is, we can welcome it. And there are occasional visitations and maybe even letters from that house guest. And I think that would then make an account for, like we might think that we're over it, and we are over it, but we're going to get a postcard every now and again, right? And Seneca writes, and I love this. And this is kind of a counter to the assertion that Stoicism is inherently nihilistic, which Nietzsche thinks. But he writes, "We are ungrateful for past gains because we hope for the future, as if the future, if so be that any future is ours, will not be quickly blended with the past." And here's the sentence: "People set a narrow limit to their enjoyments if they take pleasure only in the present. Both the future and the past serve for our delight." And then he just kind of goes on from there.
That's right. And part of that is about the people that we're like retaining our connection to, it's interesting because a lot of people, so this is going to be another one of those like ranting about people who don't really get Stoicism right and then portray it wrongly to other people. There's a lot of posts out there like, you got to live in the present, man. That's all because there is actually a point in Seneca where he says, I think it's in, is it on leisure, on the shortness of life? He's like, listen, the only thing you got is the present. The past doesn't exist anymore. The future doesn't exist yet. But he's not endorsing like a timeless, I'm not going to think about the past. I'm not going to think about the future. Because he also in on Shortness of Life says, hey, you can actually like read philosophers and they'll give you access to entire ages of time that otherwise you wouldn't enjoy, right? So there's this cool temporal aspect within Seneca that I don't think is actually there in the other Stoics that we read. It's something that we can draw upon as well. I like the house guest metaphor, because so they're a house guest. They don't get to stay forever. If they do want to stay forever, then we're going to have a conflict, right?
Right.
And maybe you need somebody else to come in and help you pack up their crap and get them to leave.
You have to call the other house guests. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. And, I really like, one of the philosophical problems that's been on my mind recently is time, chronological time versus Aonic time. And those are just fancy words for, well, at least in the case of Aonic time, like how is it the case, for example, that we can live in a sort of radically present way where both the past and the future are sloughing off of that present, equidistant from one another, but yet somehow we still live folded within this ecology of the, I'm getting into sort of a Bergsonian Deleuzian thing here, but rather than just always being in the moment, it does raise the question of, in the more conventional sense, how do we live with the image of the future in the past in a way that gives us a sort of, maybe not a full equilibrium, but a manageable disequilibrium so that we can grow like that. That's, I think, a very strong ethical question.
I think that's massively important. And it's interesting because you can find, and Deleuze was good at this. You could find resources in ancient philosophy where they didn't have a problem set out to them like that, right? So they're not formulating it thematically, but there's all these like bits and pieces you could correlate together and maybe draw something cool out of it. The logic of sense, he's grappling with the Stoics and other people like that. I do want to go back though to the issue of why do we stop feeling it if we've got reasons to actually feel like the loss of a person? And I guess that part of this is it's not stated quite as such, but you could draw this out of the Stoic ideas, particularly Seneca, that emotions have kind of a shelf life as involved. They're not themselves just beliefs, right? They are complexes of affect or they call it impulse, Hornerman, and judgments about things, dogmata, and also habits and stuff like that, right? And Seneca on anger, anger is a much quicker emotion. It's not like grief, which kind of lingers and stuff like that. He says you don't want to buy into what he calls them the Aristotelians think, which is that you need anger to get stuff done, because it's not reliable. It doesn't last that long, right? Now, why does it go away? Well, we stop thinking the way that we did. Those thoughts don't have as much sticking power, even though they motivate us at the time. And I think we can think about grief that way. You know, we lose somebody that we're really close to. Like, you know, my wife and I, she's a year younger than me. And if we're lucky, we got another 30 years, you know, and sometimes we joke around about, you know, which of us is going to die first, and that they hope it's them because then they don't have to grieve the other person. And they also don't have to handle all the paperwork and associated BS that's involved. My wife handles most of the finances, so I would have to look up all these passwords and do all the work that's involved at a time when I don't want to do any of that crap, right? And you know, we can kind of project ahead about that sort of thing. So when it actually happens, we're pretty affected. And Seneca says, yeah, you're going to be affected, but it's not going to last forever. And if it is lasting too long, you should ask yourself, why is it? Is it because you think that if you aren't grieving for the person, that's a sign that you didn't love them? Well, that's a mistaken inference, right? There's a certain sense of like losing bits and pieces of the person over time anyway. I mean, I remember when my dad died, I had a cassette tape that had him talking on it. And after a while, I couldn't remember what his voice sounded like. And I really missed my dad because he was a great guy. And it was pretty unfair that he died so young. And then I would listen to the cassette tape and I would feel what I was going to feel. And it was a sense of connection, and being able to hear his voice was important. And then, like what happens with cassette tapes, inevitably, it got caught up in the cassette head and garbled up, and I stitched it together with cellophane tape at one time. And then, of course, eventually it was finally ruined. And now there's no sound, right? Because we didn't have any other recordings, you know. We had Super 8 movie footage, but that's soundless. Like a bunch of dummies. We didn't record it, you know.
My parents are still alive. My dad is in his 80s now, but I often think that too. Like, I just let voicemails pile up, and
people do that,
and I just see them, and I'm like, I better not delete those.
Yeah, that's smart. I don't think there's any voice recordings of my mom out there, and she died in 2000, you know, because she died in a earlier kind of media environment. When we didn't think too much about those sorts of things. But here's the point. Eventually, these things wear away, and we don't have to keep on grieving. We don't keep on having to have that same set of or cluster of thoughts that will pop up over and over and over again. I mean, even Augustine talks about this in that famous, is it book 4 of the Confessions? His super close friend dies, and he's got these wonderful sort of phenomenological descriptions of what it's like to grieve. And then he asks himself questions like, hey, this sucks. Why am I doing this to myself? Why am I holding on to this? And, you know, his answers are kind of similar to the Stoics, that, you know, we do this because we've got mistaken ideas. We think that we can't continue to love the person unless we feel sad, you know, that we're letting them down in some way. And if you think about what that person would want for us, if they really loved us, they sure as hell wouldn't want us to be sad all the time. It'd be more, what's the word? Not egocentric, narcissistic to expect that, right? Sort of like, you remember that bit of Tom Sawyer when they think that he's dead, and he goes into town to see his own funeral, and he's really curious. What are people going to say about me? Did they miss me and all that? And then, of course, he shows up and he's not dead, and everybody's happy. But to want that sort of thing, like to plan your own funeral to see what people would say about you, that's a sign you've got stuff wrong, right?
Lack of trust.
Yeah,
Because
yeah, there you go. Yeah.
it's like, I don't trust you guys to say anything good about me. And it's interesting thinking about the remnants, the copies of ourselves that we can use to connect to people who have passed. Because I mean, if
Yeah.
anything, it's not to break out the Baudrillard, although we should really break out the Baudrillards here. But people die with like whole, social media accounts, like more photos than ever before, more copies of themselves than ever before. And if you're unlucky, you might see occasionally. I got rid of it. So I lost my nan this year, and occasionally I check her Facebook profile to make sure that no one is using it to like post
Mm,
AI or something. Because a
yeah,
lot
yeah.
of these accounts that are posting this slop are are dead people. I did some research for my latest book, looking at this thing called digital wills, which is essentially you
Right.
sign something that says, I want my digital remains after I die to be, I want it to be deleted or put in this place, this place, and this place. Of course, these are unenforceable because your data, the copy of you that you make, your recordings into the world, is owned by the platform. And I feel like there is, I mean, grief is kind of subtly, there's some weird stuff now. Thinking about, I
Yeah.
mean, Ronnie James Dio as a singing hologram, Tupac as a singing hologram. There's this sense now, I think, that maybe in terms of uh, reliving sort of copies of the experience of lost people, we can kind of keep stretching it out forever and almost delaying that, and almost being a kind of, okay, pulling out the Derrida here, uniting the hostility and hospitality of not letting the house guests leave, not so much, not so much
Yeah,
saying,
yeah.
okay, you've overstayed your welcome, but no, you can't leave because you've recorded yourself, or I've recorded you, and I've got a virtual house guest of grief here that's constantly pumping me with this cathartic energy.
I've been thinking about that for a couple of years in terms of the avatar of me on YouTube, because that's where I'm you could say most present in the digital media sphere. And I remember it was years and years and years ago, when you look at like the total hours watched, and then you're like, oh, I wonder how many hours that translate, or how many days that translates into, and then years. And I want to say it was like maybe 8 or 7 years ago where my current age matched up with the amount of time that my videos had been watched. And my videos are all basically me, either in front of a chalkboard or books, or, in a classroom or something like that. And obviously it's a very truncated version of me, right? It's only me chatting. I mean, I do AMAs and stuff like that, and I guess I do have a few casual events, but it's not like me deciding what to wear in the morning, or making myself breakfast, or fixing some coffee, or having a casual conversation with my family, or anything like that. And then very quickly, because your YouTube channel grows not exponentially, but at least like on a log function, there's more and more hours, and pretty soon, this image of me has been watched for more hours than I've even been alive, and now it's like 200 years or something like that. And it's going to keep on going on. If I live to 80, who knows? Maybe it'll be like 1,000 years worth of watching, right? And you think to yourself, okay, well, that's kind of cool. It's nice that hopefully I'm providing some useful information about philosophy and not leading people astray, and there is engagement with it. But who is this guy? Who's this? It's not even a double, right? Because a double would have to be like me. And this guy, okay, he's like a little slice of me. And a lot of that guy is actually me with a much, not a white beard, but a brown beard and less wrinkles and stuff like that. He's not me, but he's recognizably me enough that I can have people come up to me in restaurants or at concerts and introduce themselves and say, I like your videos and stuff like that. Right. So there is a connection there. And he originated from me. He's in some ways smarter than me because he doesn't say as much dumb stuff, because all that's been edited out. Right. So
Well, I mean, this is a total aside. Do you get recognized often?
Oh, I wouldn't say often.
Yeah.
And there's really like two kinds of recognition. So actually three. So there's the weird look, right, which doesn't actually turn into somebody coming up to you. They're just looking at you, and you're like, okay, they've probably seen the videos or something else, but they're not sure where they know me from. You know, they think like maybe we went to high school together, or I, you know, was involved in their neighborhood or somehow, and they just don't know. So that's not going to
Mm.
culminate in anything. And then there's the people who, and this is more often at like conferences and things, they'll come up and they'll be like, oh, you know, I'm a fan of your videos, helpful. I use them in my classes, that sort of thing, where now it's very clear what's going on. And then there's the, like, they do a double take, and then they'll sometimes be reticent to come up because, you know, they don't want to bother me at whatever thing we're doing. Like we were at this huge music festival, Bourbon and Beyond, down in Kentucky a couple years back. Oh, it was terrible. I mean,
no.
the music was great. There were like 300,000 people there, and they didn't plan well for the food or the porta potties. It was just disgusting, you know? And it was weird too, because, so again, a little bit of a rant. You go to a music festival or a concert, you're there to see the band, right? And so you should like sit down and enjoy what you're doing. Or maybe if you want to stand up because everybody else is standing up and you're going to dance a bit, do that. But there was like this constant like stream of people, no matter what was playing, walking past like almost like a river, you know. It was like at least 20 people wide, and it just never let up. And part of it was people like going off to the porta potties, and part of it was people actually like leaving the venue. You're like, what's going on here? You know, you go to other concerts and there's constantly people like getting up to get another drink or something, and they'll do it in the middle of a song. And you're like, didn't you come here to see this band that maybe you'll never get to see again? What the hell's wrong with you? But there's a restlessness that's really kind of weird that didn't used to be the case, you know, 20, 30 years ago going to concerts. But anyway, so we're at Bourbon and Beyond. And this, you know, we're sitting there and we're watching, I think, Pearl Jam. And there's a guy, and I can like see him out of the corner of my eyes, and he's staring at me. And you never know when somebody's staring at you, if it's like they don't like the way you look, or they're going to start something with you. So I'm always a little bit leery, right? And he comes up to me and he's like, excuse me, I don't want to bother you, but are you Gregory Sadler? And I was like, yeah, I am. And, you know, this is like a couple states away. I don't know this guy from Adam. And he's like, oh, yeah, I'm a fan of your videos, you know. And usually what I'll do is I'll be like, hey, you want to take a selfie? Because, you know, they're doing something nice. I should do something nice in return. And my wife thought it was really funny that like we're in the, you know, you can't picture something more anonymous and more random than being in a giant crowd in the dark at a music festival. And yet somebody saw me and thought it was worth the time of his day to go over and chat, you know, which I guess is better than like taking a picture, you know, and then like posting it and being like, look at this jerk who I saw, or something like that.
Yeah. I mean, look, I was going to say Acid Horizon isn't as big as Greg Sadler, I will admit. However, I've had the reverse experience where I would be in public and I see people wearing designs or the merch that I've made.
Cool. Yeah.
And that's really cool. And then depending on the circumstance, in most cases, I'll go up and I'll be like, I like your bag, or I like your shirt. And then they'll look up and like, oh man, I love the podcast. Da, da, da. And so that's been like a cool meet. And then some of those people become my friends around town.
Yeah.
So
that's really cool.
Yeah. So it's been nice. But anyway, I don't, did we need to finish? Oh, Adam, I cut you off.
I would say my weirdest one was being in the mosh pit for the band Hell Ripper in a town just south of the Polish border in the Czech Republic, and then being, I mean, at this point, I had blood in my alcohol stream, and then just someone tapping me on the shoulder and saying, "Oh, you Annie from Acid Horizon," and me going, "You'll meet for a drink later," just jumping back in. This is what you need. Your mosh pit stop the stream of people because it channels them around in a nice hydraulic circle. Also, if you're the person who, I'm going back to Fame Festival this year, this time you should actually get that drink if you're watching. But there we go.
What festival was it?
Obscene Extreme.
Oh, there you go.
grindcore death metal. Napalm Death are there this year, folks. It's going to be great. Dying Fetus. Who doesn't love Pity Dying Fetus?
Well, speaking of napalm death and dying fetus, I wanted to talk a little bit more about grief.
Okay.
And in fact, I wanted to introduce a criticism and also maybe a different concept of grief. Like I think in one of the Seneca letters, there's a passing mention of somebody who chooses not to grieve or grieve very long because they have to get back to work, right? And so they've either compartmentalized it or they've, consciously intervened in that emotional experience so that they could be productive in some sense again. And one of the criticisms, especially like from a lot of the people that we deal with in our circle in radical politics and on the left, they talk about, well, Stoicism can be kind of reactionary in the sense that it's thought terminating. It kind of reintroduces the status quo. It encourages a kind of productivity that forces us to terminate certain questions about, which I think, there is a variant of Stoicism for which that might be true.
Yeah.
And then at the same time, we live in an era where there's persistent, how can I say, motivators of a sort of sustained grief, like something like I would call climate grief, for example, or like for me and for many of us watching, like if you've been on the timeline the last 9 months, 10 months or so, and you've just seen dead bodies in the rubble, continuously, like that adds up over time. And it's interesting is not the right word for this, but just as a self-study on me as a man in my late 40s, I didn't realize I was internalizing that as a kind of grief. And anybody who's been watching our Twitter timeline for the past year, maybe you saw that I had turkeys on my property. They came out of nowhere, and they looked like farm turkeys, and they would just follow me around the property and everything. And amidst everything that was going on in the news, in Palestine and everything, one of the turkeys that we had laid like 16 to 17 eggs. And it was just, I had sort of quietly invested emotionally in that event, knowing that, like, well, amidst all of the bad crap going on in the world, at least I would have this like one thing where I would have this event where all these turkeys were born. And then the day came and they were all born, and I could see them all tucked under the hen there. And it was just absolutely wonderful. 2 or 3 days later, I went out to check on the hen, and like there was like a huge kerfuffle. Some, like the hen was running around and some of the toms were running around, and I looked in the nest and all but 3 of the chicks had died. Like a weasel had got in there, or a fisher cat, which is like a little badger that we have out here. And I remember it was in that moment, like all of this sort of micro grief that I was building up came to a head. And it was almost like a medieval painting in a way. Everything became flat, and I saw nothing but death in this tableau. And I just lost it because it had been building up unconsciously over time. And this is the one, a sort of another tangential criticism of Stoicism, is that there can be kinds of grief that build up that we're just not aware of, or the impact of grief can be such that it manifests unconsciously, or in images and dreams and reveries and fantasies and so forth. And so I know I put a lot on the plate here right now, but like with the sort of political piece over here and looking at all the political motivators in the world, the climate, for example, and the kinds of things that we're either quietly enduring or that we're posting about online, and maybe we feel impotent to change these things. It seems that Stoicism might fall short of providing a complete solution to those sorts of things. But I was just curious where you see like, how do you take that criticism of Stoicism, and how would Stoicism sort of like resituate itself amidst everything I just kind of put out there?
Yeah. So I think those are valid criticisms if we're like thinking about Stoicism in terms of like, let's call them not particularly good modern reinterpretations, where it's kind of they just take whatever they want, and then, you know, there's a little mix of stiff upper lip and all that, or classical Stoicism, the text that we do have. And I'm not going to do the thing of saying, oh, well, I'm sure the solution was in this text that we lost by Zeno, because we don't know. I mean, we have no clue what the hell was in any of those texts, so we can't. That's not a fair escape valve. And I think that so there's a couple things, as you pointed out, mixed in there. The sense of being, well, the sense of having griefs that are, let's call them emotional complexes, that we're not aware of until later on, because maybe we did suppress them, we had to get on with things. And this happens a lot to like people in the military who lose a comrade, and they're like, embrace the suck, move on, do the mission, you know. But it happens to a lot of other people who are told, hey, it's time to move on as well. And I'll give you an example of a guy that I knew a while back. He was probably in his 20s. It was down when I was at Fayetteville State University, and he was working for the Center for Service Learning and Justice, where I was a fellow for that year. His name was Rodney, and he lost his mom. You know, his mom was probably in her 50s or so. I think she had a heart attack and died, and it was very unexpected. And he was like the oldest kid, so he had to handle all the crap. And I, you know, went up and I did what you do, which is, you know, I'm really sorry for your loss. You know, if you need anything, the sort of standard thing that you do with people. And then a couple days later, I told him, hey, by the way, I know what it's like to, you know, go through this sort of thing. Everybody's going to be like in your face, expressing condolences for about the next week and a half. And then everybody's going to ghost you, and you're going to be on your own. And if you try to bring stuff up, people are going to be like, haven't you moved on yet? You know, and the 6-month mark will probably be about the worst. And so here's my card. And if you want to talk to me, you know, 4 months in, I'm there for you then. I'm not going to be there for you now because you got enough people there for you now. But down the line, when you're actually feeling bad about that. So there's things like that happen quite a lot. And then there's all sorts of like crap that, like you mentioned, you know, it builds up over time, and we're not aware of it. And then some trivial seeming thing can come along. I mean, for me, sometimes it's listening to certain songs, you know. Tank's song about, blanking on the name, about a child who drowns in a river. Every friggin' time I listen to that song, I wind up in tears. And what's going on there? I didn't lose a child in a river or anything like that. Somehow it taps into something that produces that effect. But then it's gone after a while too. The danger sometimes is where we've used good experiences almost like a compensation for all the crappiness of our lives. And then, like you said, with the turkeys die, you take that away and everything comes back in just as bad, right? And you could look at that as like, well, maybe that's not the best strategy for dealing with these things. Instead of saying, wow, climate, you know, or I mean, the fact that we can't actually do anything about it because we've got this polarized, screwed up political system essentially dominated by elites that are invested in, you know, keeping that thing going and exploiting people. That's part of the reason we can't do much about climate, you know, because we're paralyzed. And, you know, you and I aren't part of that. We're totally cut off from it. And it could make us feel anger. You know, we could be like, F these guys, you know. Or we could feel sadness. We could feel grief over what we're losing. Every time that you learn about like a new animal species that's extinct, or, you know, an area that's been converted over to parking lots that used to be wetlands or something like that, I think we could feel a sense of grief, right? Here in Wisconsin, you can tell global warming is taking place because there's plants and animals that weren't here 30 years ago are essentially colonizing, invading spaces and driving out native species. I mean, you can just tell there's less snow. You can look at that stuff, and I think grief is one possible reaction to it, right? And it could go on for a long time. What would the Stoics say about that? I mean, I think if Seneca were around today, he probably, because he was very good at like engaging previous philosophical positions and saying we need to take them seriously, even the Epicureans. And that was sort of like saying, as an American, yeah, even those dirty Russians, we'll see if they have something worth saying, right? I mean, the Epicureans were really persona non grata to most of the Stoics, and Seneca is willing to take them on. So I think if he were around today, he probably would be tackling the issue of unconscious drives, motivations, things that we have to bring to light. I think he would be more inclined to think about, I mean, they didn't have any idea of us being able to wreck the world, or the natural environment. Seneca would say, okay, I get it now, right? And I think that part of what he would say is, okay, we may be wrong about some of the mechanics of how this works or how we set up these values, but what's really important is figuring out why we feel the way we do, and if it's beneficial for us to keep on feeling that way, or whether some of what's going on, not all of what's going on, is based on some mistaken ideas or assumptions, and then we can live a happier life. We don't necessarily have to be perfect or sages or anything like that to live a happy life. And a happy life is not just retreating and hiding away from all of one's connections. It's living it more fully, living with your partner or family or friends or community members, So you notice it's not a complete response.
Yeah. Adam, do you want to hop in?
I was thinking about particularly sort of the remnants of grief. I mean, yeah, grieving for the world, preemptive grief, which I find really interesting. The idea that we are grieving preemptively, that we can see death coming, and it's almost like the guest arrives early at the house, or it's Alcibiades running into Plato's symposium and demanding that you see to him now in using a heavy euphemism for that in the case of Alcibiades and Socrates. I mean, is preemptive grief? What would the Stoic response be to a preemptive grief? Because in the latter Seneca letter, the 99 one, like even in 66, there's a sense in which the sweetness, the pleasure, especially in the 99, she says about a certain pleasure in our sadness.
Mm-hmm.
And is that cathartic? Is it a way of purifying ourselves of it through the experience of it? Or is that too Aristotelian? Does the experience of grief, in a preemptive way, actually put us on some practical level of finding a solution? Because if we're already grieving with something, if we can see it slipping away, then maybe we can grab onto it. Or maybe is that too attached to its object? Maybe then, if I'm saying, was that too attached, is that more less of a modern Stoicism than the actual Stoicism of a practical distance, not practical distance, but a practical, let's say, hydraulic attitude to one's own drives and one's own emotional intensities?
Yeah, I mean, the pleasure that Seneca talks about, he's not endorsing the mixed pleasure. He actually says, hey, you don't have to have mixed pleasure. You can have just pleasure, no pain mixed in with it. But that's, you have to do some work to get there. But that's not preemptive. That's after the person's dead. But the Stoics do have something, and they don't call it preemptive grief. They call it premeditation of bad things, right? So you think to yourself, and Seneca suggests doing this, thinking about your own death. You can do it daily if you want to. You can there's a lot of different ways to do this. And by the way, I'll mention too, Donald Robertson is a good person to talk to about this, because he stresses that not everybody should do this practice. If you've got like, anxiety problems, maybe premeditatio malorum isn't for you. Like, a lot of people are like, hey, the Stoic toolkit, I'll just apply these things and I'll be A-okay. No, you got to know what you're doing. It's sort of like playing around with medicines. Maybe there's some medicines you shouldn't take. So anyway, thinking ahead of time about the fact that, like, again, with my wife, I can think about, well, what is it going to be like if she dies when she's 60? And then I've got another 20 years to go on without her. What's it going to be like in the short term? What's it going to be like in the long term? And when I'm doing that, I'm not just sort of like imagining, I'm also awakening feelings, whether it's grief, anxiety, anger. I mean, people use premeditatio malorum for all sorts of emotional matters. You can even use it for what we think of as good emotions. The Stoics, they have this, they think that joy or pleasure ought to be within certain rational limits, right? So I can, let's say I'm going to go to a concert and I fall into the trap that I'm sure both of you have seen other people do, where they're like, this is going to be the best event ever. I'm going to have such a great time. It's going to be amazing. I'm going to go see, and it's like 5 bands that you've always wanted to see, and they're all going to play really good. And of course you get there, and now you're stuck in a line with a bunch of people, some of whom probably should have showered 3 days ago, but haven't. And you make it in and your seats kind of suck. They're not comfortable to sit in. That's okay, because you're going to stand up most of the time anyway. And then your feet start to hurt. And, there's all these little flies in the ointment, right? I mean, that's sort of like what Epictetus talks about in Enchiridion 4 in terms of going to the bath. He's like, when you go to the bath, what's it going to be like? For us, it's more public pools. Well, people are going to splash you. They're going to be noisy. They're going to steal your stuff, he doesn't say this, but somebody's going to pee in the pool, there'll be all sorts of stuff going on. So if you do premeditatio malorum, you could actually, like, before you go to the concert, you're like, hey, let's imagine what could actually go wrong with this. So I'm not having such high expectations that I'm going to feel bad afterwards. So, you can do this with a lot of different things, grief included, I think, and it's probably prudent to do it. I mean, it's better than being in denial. I think this is less of a problem these days, but in the past, it used to be, you talk to people about death. What do you want your funeral to look like? What should we do with things? Then I don't want to talk about that. I don't want to think about that. And I mean, if you've ever had to handle somebody's estate, you realize, boy, you really do want to talk about this stuff ahead of time. It's so much hassle. And then you've got all the dealing with everybody else who's not remotely a Stoic, who have all sorts of crazy ideas about what they ought to do at the funeral, or they want to be in charge of something, or they're starting to go through your parents' stuff already. Oh, I think I'll take this vase. They promised it to me, or whatever, right? You're going to have to deal with all this wild stuff. So it's better to have thought about it ahead of time and maybe felt your way through it. And then it's not as bad when you get to it. It's not a, magic bullet. I think some people approach not just Stoicism, but all sorts of intentional ways of living as if, I just do this thing and then everything's going to be great. And that's just silly, right? But there's always going to be some people doing that and then complaining about it afterwards that it didn't work for them.
Yeah, when I had my serious encounter with Stoicism when I was teaching in the prisons, I decided to become a Stoic as a sort of provision, as an experiment, and just do all the stuff that they, you know what I mean? Like, I'm going to get into this. I'm going to do all the stuff that they do and see where it takes me. And the one variation of the exercise that you're talking about that I did comes from Epictetus, where you have, I mean, they lived fairly Spartan lives, and maybe the one affordance that you did have is maybe like a nice ceramic cup or something like that, right? And living in that sort of minimal environment, and that being maybe the only thing that you do have, it's possible that you're cathecting a lot of emotional energy and charge into that specific object. Now here I have like tons of books, tons of gear, and so forth. And actually, in a way, having more stuff, if one thing goes wrong, like if this camera goes out, like it's going to be on my mind for days. You know how it goes,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
But I found that was a useful exercise, like just imagining the destruction of something that I did invest some material value within, or something very important to me, or a person passing away, or, meeting some sort of tragic end. Of course, this is probably another one that should come with a warning label, because if you have a sort of tendency to overthink, or,
ruminate, catastrophize.
Ruminate. Yeah. If you ruminate upon catastrophes, it's going to undermine you. And so, there's a kind of limit, I think, for everybody when it comes to doing this. And it kind of like ran into my reading of Nietzsche a little bit. Like we know Nietzsche's criticism of the Stoics, in that there's a kind of moralizing projection of negativity onto nature. Everything's coming to pass. Things won't be here forever, sort of thing. And, for Nietzsche, there's a superabundance, there's an exuberance to life, and so forth. And I would say that over time, that kind of meditation that I undertook, I never really stopped doing it. And you find yourself doing it in the shower or in the car or something like that. But then I slightly modified it over time, using like kind of active imagination techniques and so forth. But I think one of the good things about an encounter with Stoicism, and making a modest commitment to it for a short period of time, is you carve out this mental space that is, first of all, a rupture in the flow of just everyday life as it is.
Right.
And then you get to do something different, and it creates that little kill switch or stopgap, or whatever we want to call it, that lacunae between this moment and the next, where you get to consider, how you can manage a certain outcome, for example.
It's interesting, because you see this in like really any intentional way of living. Whether it's philosophical, there's religious traditions that do this. They all have that. It's not a disconnection, but it's sort of like a stretching, right? You don't have to act to something immediately. You can sit there and say, "Oh, what's going on here?" Even in science fiction, A. Van Vogt was influenced by the Center for General Semantics, or Society for General Semantics. He called it the thalamic pause, and he worked it into his Null A novels, so it's, this is something that actually works. And it's sort of like doing exercise or dieting. You say like, oh, it's New Year's, I'm going to get control over my body. I've gotten too fat. I need to get myself back in shape. I mean, there's a lot of crappy diets out there, but you're almost guaranteed to lose a good 5 pounds when you first start, because you're actually paying attention to what you're doing. Or if you go to the gym, you start doing any exercise, it's better than no exercise. It might not suit you overall. I mean, there's all these runners who you notice they like screw up their joints, and sometimes other things about them, because they're too obsessive with their running. So, you don't want to do everything necessarily, but doing something is likely to lead to at least some temporary positive outcomes. And then you can ask about, okay, well, which philosophies is way of life or wisdom traditions, which am I getting the most out of? And I'm kind of a William Jamesian in this respect. I don't think that we all have to have the same philosophical movement or set of tools. We can not only be eclectic about it, but it's also very often driven by what he calls our passional and volitional life. So, it's some of it too might also be age of life. So I didn't think, I read Marcus Aurelius when I was in college, and Epictetus, and I thought the toughness stuff was really cool, because I was into being a tough guy back then. And I thought all this virtue stuff was just silly moralizing. I was much more into Nietzsche at the time, frankly. And it wasn't until much later that I was able to appreciate what was being said, and that it might be useful for me. Something changed in me temperamentally, you could say, right? And I think it's fine. I don't think that everybody needs to be a Stoic or an Epicurean or a Nietzschean, or pick whatever you want. We should be thoughtful about it and figure out what actually works for us. And as you're mentioning, we should be experimental about it too. We should try stuff and see if it works. And if it does, you know, we don't have to become evangelists about it and recommend it to everybody, but we can certainly think about how it could be useful for us and other people we care about, you know?
I've been carrying on a bit of a backdoor conversation with somebody in our sort of broader community of people who do podcasts and so forth. His name is Jeremy Johnson. I'm not sure if you're familiar with him. He was friends with Michael Brooks. If you're familiar with him, he was a
The
podcast.
names ring a bell, but
Yeah, but I think I take they have a sort of view of politics where there's a kind of a meta-political theory, like an integralist theory. Like, how do we live in a society like where we have people have these different passional commitments to different political values or difference, and how do we then, you know, sort of create a way of thinking about that difference and allowing things to exist in a multiplicity, you know, whatever sort of metaphor we want to use. I mean, of course, there's problems with that. Maybe this is just a sort of backdoor way to sneak in a kind of unity that brings everyone together. But I think there is some value, you know, despite that, you know, like you're saying, we can chalk it up to maturity, or maybe it's simply a matter of being able to think like one step beyond ourselves and thinking like there's different stages of life. There, we are gripped by different passions in different decades. And when we come to realize that, I think part of the quote unquote integration or the coexistence of a community of people is allowing for people to try and experiment with these ideas in ways that's meaningful to them and serves that drive or desire that feels enlivening to them.
Yeah, I'd agree. I mean, it is tough to pull off. I wouldn't say integralist, because that's got the whole connotation of like, you know, the hard right, you know, it all needs to be religious. And
sure,
I mean, that goes back to Action Française in the early 20th century. There were all these integral nationalists. And it's interesting because the ones who are doing it today, they're basically like knockoffs of Charles Marat and other people from that time. But to have an integrated community where we recognize what drives people and what they're into and where their talents lie. I mean, that was part of what the Republic was supposed to be providing, you know. You know, people are like, oh, this is terrible. It's this utopia where they tell you where to go. No, they're like, hey, you got a talent for fighting and being brave and all that, whether you're a guy or a girl, you know, you're going to be in that warrior or soldier or auxiliary class. Oh, you're interested in ideas, and you know, you'd rather do that than make pots or farm. Hey, you're going to be a guardian. Now, you won't have any money, of course. There's a bunch of other commitments, but that was the general idea behind that. And I think, you know, good political theories, if they're going to be good for people, they have to have some room for that, rather than just, well, we're all just going to try to keep from being at each other's throats, or, you know, whoever's in charge gets to make the rules. No, you know, you want people to actually be able to have full human development. But sometimes that full human development sure as hell doesn't mean reading philosophy all day long.
Yeah, no doubt. Yeah. I would say back in November of last year, I made a strong commitment to just like get physical again, be at the gym like 4 times a week. And let me tell you, it's done wonders for my reading by not involving myself with philosophy, by making that sort of intentional break. It's been wonderful. But Greg, I don't want to keep you too long. We've been on for 1 hour and 22 minutes so far. There's some questions in the queue.
Yeah, let's take them.
And if anyone's listening right now, we have almost 500 viewers on the stream right now, which is like,
oh, that's cool.
We've massively broke the record. I think before it was like 50. So we're like 10 times. The fame of Dr. Greg Sadler has pushed us to a new horizon here, which is amazing. So here's the first one, maybe. And they posted this a while back. Not Noah says, curious to hear your thoughts on the modern revitalizing of Stoicism as broicism that tends to overgeneralize. Now, this is something that we've been talking about. We've talked about it a bit at the beginning, but maybe you want to sort of restate your sentiments on that.
Yeah, and I'll mention too that within the modern Stoic community, we have a couple like variants. Like there's Stoicism also written with a $sign, you know, which is like the grifty kind of stuff. And that can overlap with broicism. So the broicism thing is the emphasizing a particular vision of masculinity. Usually you'll see these people like being into Sparta, and also, you know, trying to claim that, you know, because the word virtus came from vir, that virtues are really masculine and all that. I mean, overlooking the fact that like the warrior virtue in Greek is Andrea, which is feminine. You know, so they're not even consistent with that. That by the way, is my wife's name, Andrea.
Oh, nice.
So she's named after courage itself. And you know, so the Broicism thing tends to emphasize the toughness. Stoicism is going to make you more masculine. It'll also help you like with dating, because either you'll be like an alpha male and you'll attract, you know, any guy who's like, it's going to attract females. When you're calling women females, that's a sign usually of what's going on. And then, you know, or you'll learn how to do without them altogether. You know, you can embrace incelism in a way that will turn it into something, you know, less painful. You know, some of the MGTOW guys are attracted to that sort of thing, the men going their own way.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, there's like a whole bunch of people out there preaching this kind of stuff. And, you know, they don't know what they're talking about, because all you got to do is spend a little bit of time with classic Stoic texts to see that like every single one of them would have condemned this sort of thing. So, you know, there's a lot of different misappropriations, let's say, of Stoicism. And then that's probably one of the ones that attracts young guys a lot. Although it's weird to see like people my age who espouse that sort of thing. You'll be like, what is wrong with you? You know, how did you get that far off the track? But maybe by 50, you should have things kind of figured out, you know?
Yeah. Here's just another one. Shout out Tone says, love seeing Dr. Sadler on this program. Thanks for having this wonderful conversation. Hey, thank you for being here again. And it's always a good time. Another similar one here, just pull this one up. Raymond Zeta says, I think it was Dr. Sadler who first introduced me to Shestov's thought. His writing about the night of Gethsemane comes to mind listening.
Yeah, Shestov is a really interesting thinker. He's one of the people who early on sees the connections. He's what we call a second wave existentialist figure, with the first being like, you know, Kierkegaard, Nietzsche, Dostoevsky, maybe Tolstoy in some respects, a few others here and there. And then Shestov, before the turn of the century, is already writing books about like what's going on in Nietzsche and Dostoevsky and how it's similar themes, you know. Weirdly enough, he doesn't get introduced to Kierkegaard until like the 30s. And he leaves Russia because of the revolution, comes over to France, and then he's part of like that whole like cycle of people, very fertile ground for stuff, a lot of them Russian emigres. And unfortunately, the reason he doesn't make it big is in part because he is so hyper skeptical, you know, that he won't commit to a particular position. And he only has one major student, Benjamin Fondin, who dies in the death camps, right? So he doesn't have other people like saying, oh, you got to read this guy. But he's a massively important figure in the 20s through like the 50s or so. And I love him. I think he's delightful to read. I don't always agree with him, but I find him pretty insightful. So, you know, I'm glad that Riemann is enjoying Shestov's thought as well. He's kind of, you know, we could call it like, you know, in the stock market, you get these stocks that are like super undervalued, and if you buy them, it's going to pay off for you. Shestov is like that.
I mean, he's a huge influence on Deleuze, and also I think Bataille was his student.
He'd be like a contemporary, yeah.
Yeah, I think Bataille was his student for a while, at least Bataille. I did a video on that like 2 years ago now, but
Fondin as well, actually.
And that was actually one of our first episodes, like our first
really?
One's Existential Monday.
Yeah, we read that. Have you read Existential Monday? I think you probably have it.
No.
Oh, no. Well worth it. Well worth your time.
Okay.
And I believe it's an NYRB release. And if they're still having their sale, you can grab it. Yeah, it's a great book. Yeah,
It's a
definitely
paper
worth it.
delivered at a conference happening during the war itself, and
Oh,
Fondant knows in a way that he has been ratted out to the Gestapo, and he's sort of
oh man.
in a way sort of giving a paper, sort of saying sort of in a way sort of parodying, giving these readings of Kierkegaard and Hegel, almost saying why are we doing a conference at this time? Sort of, it is an incredibly underrated in its power of an essay. It absolutely recommends the
Yeah.
Fondant.
Oh, here's one more message. It says, I'd feel like an a-hole bothering YouTube or any other public figure when they're out doing their living their private lives. Well, if you see me in public, you have permission to do unto others as you would like done to you. But which in my case means, I mean, say hi, just be my friend. You know, that's cool. I don't I don't mind. I don't think I'm anyone that special anyway. And I guess
Yeah,
it's cool for you too, right?
I mean, I think it's one of those things where like you don't want to be at either extreme, right?
Right.
If you're like, well, they're out enjoying themselves, I don't want to bother them at all. Who am I to do that?
Yeah.
I mean, a lot of people are pretty cool with it. I mean, I guess like there's being like YouTube famous, and then there's being famous. So like, if I saw Faye Dunaway eating in a local restaurant, I doubt I would go up to her and be like, I loved you in the Three Musketeers. You were the best lady to winter ever, But then again, maybe she'd be like, oh, thanks. Nobody said that in a while, or something like that. And obviously, you don't want to be, I don't know, what would you call it? You don't want to be careless. You don't want to be entitled with your access to the person. So if they're having dinner with their family, you don't want to be hanging around for 20 minutes asking them questions about the latest thing that they talked about. That wouldn't be very cool. But I think, just coming over and saying hello and expressing your appreciation. I mean, I know I've done that with people who I like, and I then you just kind of like do your thing and go back to you over there, and they get to enjoy themselves over there. I think there's nothing wrong with that. It could actually, you never know what's going on with people too. It could be like, and I'm not saying this would be the case for me, but there could be somebody whose like career is taking a nosedive, and what they really need is somebody to come over and say, I really like your stuff, like authors or musicians, or I don't know who,
You've seen that movie Invincible with Mark Wahlberg. It's like a Disney movie where he plays Vince Papale, the walk-on member of the Philadelphia Eagles in like the early 80s.
I haven't seen that. No.
I mean, it's totally corny, but there's actually a really good scene in there where he's at the practices. He's not doing well. He's not doing well in the game, thinking about giving up, and he's driving his car home, and he almost hits a kid who's playing in the street. And as the kid runs away in the headlights, you can see that he has his the number of his jersey like in masking tape on the back. It's really well done. I have
that
to
is
hand
cool.
it.
Yeah,
that's cool. But I've never been starstruck, but I used to live in LA. But the one celebrity that I did meet who was really cool to me was Lionel Richie. And I think I've talked. Yeah, I used to do these parties, and he was there quite a bit. And it was actually in the days of like Nicole Richie and Paris Hilton and stuff. So this is way back when. Yeah. And like I was just near him, and we started talking. And I had to say, and it's like, you probably get this all the time, but growing up, my mom and I, we loved your music. I'm a musician now. I'm trying to make it out here. And it was almost as if somebody had turned down the lights and put a spotlight right on Lionel Richie. And he said, whatever you do, just be relentless in following your dreams. Gave me the whole thing, and I got the blessing from Lionel Richie. And so if
that's really cool. Yeah,
I've made it, man.
On that sort of starstruck topic, in academic circles, right? It's sort of like being a musician, and then you get to go backstage with some, with Kiss or Judas Priest or something like that. Yeah. I've been fortunate to meet, quite a few big name people who've written a lot of books and stuff like that. And it's cool. And because in virtue ethics, you either walk the walk or you don't, right? And so I can name some who I've met, and I had that sort of starstruck kind of thing, and they're just cool people, and they're not what you'd call in the biblical sense respecters of persons, and that was a big thing for me too. Like Alistair McIntyre is like that, Julie Annis is like that, Nancy Sherman, they can kind of like make their own. If they're at a conference and they want to talk to somebody, they can go off at little elite circles and do that. But the cool thing about these people is they'll chat with anybody. I mean, McIntyre's sort of like a Socrates in that respect. Doesn't go around barefoot, of course, but
We'll do one more. This is actually for Adam. It says, I'm 99% sure I saw Adam on the streets of London last October on one of the days of a pro-Palestine protest and failed to say hi. But if I could go back in time, I would say hi, Adam. So look, Adam getting recognized.
So everyone, you feel free to say hi. I'm well more than willing to dispel any notions of parasociality, because you will find me sitting somewhere alone in a bar in London, reading Baudrillard, listening to the work of Sabotage, and drinking far too much Guinness, and that will be a good way of dispelling any sort of notions of intellectual pretense.
Yeah. I'm going to say, if you've noticed me on any given day of the week, you're probably a groundhog or a blue jay, given where I live. So that's it. But maybe we'll wind down the stream. Greg, let's get your links, things. Where can we find you? What are some things that you'd like people to be directed to right now?
So I realized recently, so I guess if there's like one new thing, I've got a Substack, right? Because everybody has a Substack now, but I'm trying to do some good stuff with it. But it's cool because I can, if you just put in Gregory Sadler into Google, all this stuff pops up, right? And it's hell for anybody else who's named Gregory Sadler. And there's a bunch of them out there because it's a pretty common name. And so right now I'm riding high in the whatever Google, their algorithm or something like that. So I'm super easy to find. There's, a YouTube channel, there's all sorts of other stuff. I'm in social media. So in a way, I don't have to be like, www.https, sort of stuff anymore, because it's, for the moment, I'm well off in that way, you could say.
You're the top Sadler out there. That's great.
Well, no, I'm not the top Sadler.
What?
William Sadler, the actor, is the top Sadler. Okay. And deservedly so. He's a great actor. I love him. He's done a lot of cool. He's sort of like what do you call these people that they get typecast?
Okay.
What's the name for that in acting?
Character actor or typecasting?
Character actor, yeah. So he often played a lot of bad guys or hapless good guys, Usually didn't get to be the star of things, although he was in a crappy Billy Zane movie, which I want to call was like Demon Knight or something, or some B-rate horror movie. And I was so happy to see him in there, as being like the main actor, because he so rarely gets to do that.
Oh, he's the bad guy in Hard to Kill with Steven Seagal.
That sounds right. Yeah.
Yeah.
He's played a lot of bad guys, Actually, I'll tell you very quickly, because I've got to go. You've got to go.
Yeah.
There is a guy we recently, in like the last year, we rewatched Babylon 5, the whole thing.
Okay.
Or not Babylon 5, Deep Space Nine. I often get those two mixed up because they're both space stations. And the guy who played Dukat, the Cardassian, he's actually from Milwaukee originally. And I've been trying to figure out how to get in touch with him, because his portrayal on that was just absolutely excellent. He plays a bad guy so well. And it turns out that he is a character actor who has played like a million different things. He's in his 80s now. He's retired. And I'd like to write him a fan letter and say, loved your performance in this, realize that I saw you in this and this and this and this. It's so cool. You are, you managed to be both urbane and creepy at the same time. I don't know how you pull it off, but you certainly did,
Well, that's awesome. Well, you see, that's a direction for Sadler to go, is like start interviewing celebrities and doing philosophy with
Wouldn't
the socialites and the high elites.
wouldn't
But
that be funny?
yeah, well, Greg, once again, it was great to have you on the show, and we'd love to have you back in the
Absolutely.
future. And thanks everyone for listening.
Always a pleasure.
Please, as you log off, either check out Greg's Substack and subscribe to our Patreon account, Acid Horizon Podcast, on patreon.com. Thank you. Take care and have a wonderful weekend, everybody.
Take care, everyone.
Thanks for having me on.